fifth episode begins with Ellen dressing for Beltane, where she will accompany Malcolm Grant as his betrothed. Jocasta interrupts to compliment her sister's appearance and inform her that they're about to leave. At Castle Leathers, Brian asks Julia if she's ready to depart for Beltane. The plan is to sneak away without anyone noticing them. Brian tells Julia about Beltane. Folks gather from all over to celebrate the beginning of summer on neutral ground. Julia asks about the fertility blessing. Brian informs her that it's more geared toward blessing a woman before she has a bairn in the belly. Unfortunately, Brian and Julia don't get far before Divina catches them. Julia reassures Divina that she did as much housework as possible to help Divina while she's gone. Brian lies, claiming he wants to take Julia to the fertility ritual at Beltaine. Divina remarks that Lord Lovat will want to keep Julia close, considering the child is his. Brian's going to have a baby brother. Brian calls out Julia for lying to him. Of course, she can't disclose the truth in front of Divina. He leaves for the celebration without Julia. Meanwhile, Clan Mackenzie is en route to Beltane. Jocasta strikes up a conversation with the daydreaming Ellen. She observes that Ellen will wear many resplendent gowns and ride in fancy carriages once she weds Malcolm. Of course, Jocasta knows her sister isn't thinking about Malcolm. She reminds Ellen that Beltane is a celebration where sins burn away in the needfire. Then Murda finds Brian preparing to leave for Beltane. Murda hopes to catch Ellen there. Sure, she's betrothed to Malcolm Grant, but engagements can be broken. He assumes Brian will be a solid wingman. Later, the Mackenzies arrive at Beltane. Ned advises Ellen not to do anything rash, to remain on Malcolm's good side. If he decides not to marry her, Colum could easily find someone worse. Then Ellen reunites with Malcolm, while Jocasta tags along. Jocasta chimes in that Ellen wouldn't stop talking about Malcolm on the way there. Ellen returns the favor by telling Malcolm that Jocasta will want to receive fertility blessings at the stones. At the same time, Ned meets with Henry. Henry asks Ned about the stones. Of course, that's how he arrived in this century. Ned explains that maidens dance around the stones at nightfall to appease the fairies and prevent folks from being taken by them. The chat turns to Isaac Grant receiving that letter from Lovat in which he voiced his concern regarding Ellen's reputation. Ned insists there's nothing to worry about. Ellen's reputation is pristine. He adds that Lovat is merely worried about his alliance with the Grants. Lovat blames Red Jacob for Clan Fraser's downfall, for stripping him of his titles. However, Lovat sullied his own reputation by kidnapping and raping a noblewoman. Meanwhile, Ellen participates in a dance competition that will determine the May Queen of Beltane. Malcolm reveals that being a solid dancer is only part of the criteria for winning that May Queen crown. Brian surreptitiously joins the dance, much to Ellen's delight. She insists they must pretend not to know each other, though. Murda observes them dancing, hoping Brian's putting in a good word for him. They decide to meet later at the abandoned castle tower. Jocasta sidles up beside Murtaugh. Murtaugh urges her to dance with him despite not being a maiden. After the dancing, Ellen is unsurprisingly crowned the May Queen. Now, she must select a king. Malcolm, Murtaugh, and Brian are among those who throw their hats in the ring. Ellen chooses Malcolm to avoid suspicion. At Leather's Maestri, Lovat's seer is there to offer divinations on Beltane. This is when the veil between worlds is the thinnest. Maestri tells Lovat that she sees men ensnared in a field of thorns. However, he's not among them. He stands victorious, reveling in his inevitable return to power. Lovat asks about his unborn child. Maestri asks Julia to hold an egg against her very pregnant stomach. Then she breaks that egg into a bowl. Lovat remarks that there are 2 yolks in the bowl. Could he have twins? Maestri gazes at the yolks, observing that, yes, there are 2 children, 1 lass, 1 lad. But the lass comes later. Elsewhere, Ellen and Jocasta strike a deal. Ellen will sneak off to do her own thing, and Jocasta can do the same. They will vouch for each other and swear they both received the fertility blessings. Next, Brian and Ellen have their clandestine meeting near the castle tower. They have at least until sunset when the ceremony takes place. They finally have their first kiss. Murtaugh watches them smooch from afar. Ellen and Brian head inside the castle tower, where they continue kissing. Brian's afraid to go too far. He doesn't want to ruin her virtue. "Ruin me," Ellen whispers before they take it further. Brian rips off a piece of his tartan and wraps it around their clasped hands as they recite vows. "Blood of my blood and bone of my bone," they finally make up. Afterward, Ellen and Brian lay entwined in postcoital bliss. Brian tells Ellen about his eat, pray, love journey the year before when he left Scotland. He warns her that his father is worse than what folks say. Brian reveals he now has a reason to stay in the country. Ellen insists she would choose him again and again. Later, Archbug runs into an inebriated Murtaugh. Arch recognizes Murtaugh as the first to join Malcolm Grant as a potential May King to Ellen's May Queen. Is he trying to encroach on Malcolm's territory? Murtaugh taunts Arch before the latter administers a few hefty punches to the gut. Blood spews out of Murtaugh's mouth. Elsewhere, Davina chats with Lovat about Maesri's divinations. She states that Julia was pregnant before she arrived at Leathers. Davina asserts that Julia is not carrying Lovat's child. Lovat bulldozes over this, urging Davina to relieve Julia of her duties and ensure the birthing process goes off without a hitch. Then, Ned tells Henry about meeting the love of his life in Edinburgh. They tragically parted ways, unfortunately. Ned had to choose between dwelling in his sorrow or starting anew. Red Jacob offered him that opportunity for a fresh start after he robbed Ned of his valuables. Ned believes Henry's search for Julia will consume him whole. Perhaps it's time to move on. Meanwhile, Julia pulls out her wedding ring, which is missing a gem. She slips it onto her finger. Before the needfire ceremony, Malcolm gives Ellen a gift. At the same time, Jocasta sees a swaying and bloody Murtaugh standing alone in one of the tents. She urges him to sit down. Then, Jocasta takes a cloth to Murtaugh's bloody lip. They kiss. It's all going well until Murtaugh calls out Ellen's name. Jocasta pulls away instantly and storms out in tears. Next, Julia writes a letter to Henry as the needfire ceremony commences. People dance in animal masks as the fire rages. Henry watches the maidens dance around the stones. Eventually, Ellen and Malcolm walk down the aisle toward the fiery display in their Beltaine attire. Brian watches from the sidelines. Murtaugh glares at his cousin as Jocasta gazes mournfully at Murtaugh. Henry lies on his cot, tears in his eyes. He clutches his necklace from Julia. Julia also lies on her bed. She kisses her wedding ring. At the ceremony, Malcolm kisses Ellen on the lips. Julia's voiceover to Henry wonders whether their split was out of their control. Perhaps they're victims of space and time. Malcolm grabs Ellen's hand and raises it in triumph as the crowd cheers. Sure, they look like they're dressed for their wedding. However, Ellen and Brian's vows in the castle tower hold true for them.